Listen, genuinely, just love you and been praying with you and for you. Hope you had an amazing weekend and enjoyed the snow and did not experience any of the pains of Snowpocalypse 2014, whatever that was. Yeah. We built a very ugly snowman. I don't remember snowmen being as ugly as the ones I built this weekend with my kids. I don't know what, maybe in Idaho, when we would have snow in Idaho, there was probably enough of it that it didn't just pick up all of the dirt from the ground and leaves. So I have this imagination of building snowmen that felt cartoonish. And basically this was like a dirt ball. So, anyways, it was a magical wonderland. And today, just over this little bit of time that we have, I want to invite you into just the heart of God for us in this season and the heart of what Mark begins to do as he moves us through his gospel and the person of Jesus. And as we, over these next several weeks, look at the vision of who Jesus is, the Son of God, through this first half of the Gospel of Mark, my prayer is not only that you have moments of revelation about who he is, but that you'll actually allow with fresh eyes the vision of the life of Jesus to begin to push on the edges of your own life, to begin to awaken the desires and the realities of who you are and who God has called us to be. And one of the things that is fascinating that Mark does, which is so true to storytelling and beginning to rightly frame the truth of a scenario, is that he begins, as we looked at last week, with this vision of identity and purpose, and then immediately moves the story into conflict. And when you begin to think about all of the great stories, this is exactly how they start. That there is a sense of an invitation, an initial invitation about something. But then that invitation is thrust immediately into the conflict of the hour and the conflict at hand, right? And what Mark wants us to see is there really is an invitation about Jesus that we have to wrestle with. There really is this vision of who is Jesus and who does he say that he is? And most importantly, who do we say that he is? And he captures this vision for us of a Jesus who wants to come and rescue, a Jesus who we have been waiting for, a Jesus who is the reconciler, the redeemer of all things. And after he invites us into the person of Jesus, then he begins to tell us about the conflict of the story. Part of the reason that I think this matters for us is because it actually invites us into the honest reality of what it means to follow Jesus. Because following Jesus will only happen when you find him and follow him in the conflict, not around it. That the reality is to choose Jesus, to follow Jesus, in many ways is to intentionally place yourself into the conflict. Because the truth is you can't avoid it. To follow Jesus is a disruption. To know Jesus is a disruption. And what you're going to find is that what Jesus wants to do in our lives is a work of disruption. And one of the things that I've been praying for us as a church family, that we as a staff have been talking about and praying through is how much in this season we believe God wants to disrupt us. Not to harm us, but for the purposes of what disruption is. The purpose of disruption is really quite simple. For whatever reason, and there can be many of them, we find ourselves in a status quo, in a way of operating, in a system of functioning that just seems to harden. It's forms become so regular and ordinary. You begin to function in the motions, and without even knowing it, something moves from what was once a choice of devotion and sincerity just to the way things are. And then God has this way in his kindness of disrupting us so that we can see what he sees and we can move into alignment with him. This is why God disrupts. Because left to ourselves, we have a way of coalescing in the wrong direction. We take the forms of something, but we miss the heart of it. And so Jesus disrupts so that we can return to the true heart of who he is, the true heart of what he's doing, and the true heart of who we are. And I believe we need this. I would say that more than any other conversation that I'm having in this season with people is that the ways of life feel both overwhelming and burdensome, and as if a routine that people do not know how to break free from. And I just even invite you to stop and pause and consider that in your own life. Where do you feel almost trapped within your own life? Where do you feel confined by the non-negotiable rhythms and realities? What about your story has gone from what once was devotion, sincerity, and zeal to just simply the normalized rhythms that have this way of losing their meaning? I think Jesus wants to disrupt us. I think Jesus wants to move us into conflict. I think Jesus wants to reveal who he is, what he's doing, and who we are. But the only way we're going to allow, the only way we're going to see it, the only way it's going to manifest in our lives is it has to get messy. It's what we don't want. But behind it is the true longing of our hearts. And I am praying that God in this season begins to make things messy, begins to make the ordinary different, because I think he wants us to see with his eyes and understand what he's trying to do within us and through us. And when I think about disruption in my own life, there's these stories that begin to emerge, and stories of all different kinds, because the reality is not every disruption is the same, and not every disruption leads to the same ends. Because what I've learned about disruptions in my own life is that a disruption can happen, but you still have to choose to allow God to do what he's trying to do in you to receive it. And I think one of these broken, just heartbreaking realities of my own life and our lives and what it means to be human is that God can actually set up a scenario of profound disruption that could lead to catalytic change, but not wanting to enter into the mess of it. We stand in our own stories like a bystander and don't receive the fullness of what God is actually trying to do in our lives. One of the moments I think about, this is one of these kind of stories in my own life, frozen in time. I've shared a lot over the years of the unique challenges and struggles that I walked through in my teenage years and this prodigal season that happened in my life. And I remember there was this series of events that happened in my senior year of high school that led to this, not only this incredibly difficult season, but this profound sense of loss of who I was, loss of what I believed, loss of my future, loss of my sense of understanding. And it was in this season I was living in a lot of secrets. My life had become so fractured into multiple people in multiple places. It wasn't just that I was living a fake life. I was unable to tell you what even my real life was. And I remember there was this day where in the loss of all of these friendships and the changing of all of these circumstances, I was witness to like this really difficult situation of a friend who was in an abusive situation. It was just hard to describe. All of even the details still are hard to describe. And I remember I drove home and I was paralyzed in almost a sense of what just happened. How do I move forward? What do I do with this? Who do I share it with? But the difficulty was that bound in the story was so many of the details of my life that I was keeping hidden. So many of the parts of who I was that I didn't know how to open up about and share. And as I drove home, and I remember I unexpectedly, my dad had gotten off work early. And I remember just sitting in the driveway of my house, like not sure what to do. I did not expect my dad to be home. And my older brother and sister had already moved out of the house. So it was my parents, they were both working. It was, early in the afternoon. And I remember just sitting in the car, like paralyzed, because I felt like just the slightest thing could break me. And it was maybe as I was sitting in the driveway for about 5 minutes, my dad walks out of the house and he's just standing on the front steps and he sees me sitting in the car and I don't know what to do. So I just kind of awkwardly get out of the car and try to walk up. And those moments where you think in your mind you can somehow like fake it till you make it. You can put on some kind of face or scenario. I just found myself lost in my ability to do that. And I remember my dad just could see something was happening. I just stood maybe 3 or 4 feet from him. He goes, "Son, are you okay?" And I couldn't respond. And inside of me was like this like longing to just tell my dad everything. But to tell my dad everything meant to tell him all the things I didn't want to tell him. And so I just stood there. I remember my dad just came and gave me this hug, and I just broke down, just began to like cry. I know that feels like something that would be normal for me. In that season, it wasn't. And when I look back on that moment in my life, I see this disruption. And bound within it was this invitation. And if I would have said yes to that invitation, I just think about how many things would have changed, how much hope would have come, how much restoration would have happened. But to partner with it, I had to step into the mess of it. Incapable or unwilling to do so, I didn't. And eventually my dad had to go back to work and I remember in that place, that very day, just feeling the weight of the loss of what I was choosing. Because in the moment where I felt like what I was ultimately choosing was my own freedom, I was actually losing all of the most sacred parts of who I was. And I'm thinking about that story this morning distinctly because it while it has an element of suffering and pain and kind of creates a scenario that is often a little bit more dramatic than the stories we're walking through all the time, I think it captures the invitation that Jesus actually has moments where he moves, he changes, and he invites us into a disruption that could redirect the future of our life. But you have to still choose it. It's something, while it is presented to you, it simply doesn't happen to you. The nature of the invitation of transformation is whether you're willing to accept the disruption or not. And I think that is at the core of this season. Are we actually willing to accept the disruptions of Jesus? Are we willing, whether they're small or they're simple, whether they're about life or things of profound pain, would we allow the disruption of Jesus to do what it's trying to do in our lives? Which is really simple, to bring us back to the heart of who Jesus is and who we are. Because that's why he disrupts. He disrupts to call us back to what's been lost. And I believe that in many of our lives, there are these pieces of something that feels as if it's been lost. But Jesus, in his kindness, is inviting us back into the fullness of who he is and who we are. But he's going to do it through disruption. He's going to do it through the invitation into the mess. And as Mark tells the story of Jesus, as I said, he begins with this picture of his identity and his purpose, but then he moves immediately into the conflict of disruption. Mark chapter 2 has 4 stories, and all of them are immediately stories of conflict. They're immediately stories of disruption. And even for the first readers, they would have been far more than this. This is the first story about Jesus and a paralyzed man who comes to Jesus for healing, which is the story that we're actually going to lean into intentionally next week. But there's this invitation about not only Jesus who has the authority to heal, but Jesus who has the authority to forgive. It's a disruption of massive consequence. Who is he and who are we? And immediately from that story, we go into this second invitation. We find that Jesus finds himself with this tax collector named Levi, and that Jesus is willing to invite the unthinkable, the least likely, not only to follow him, but then the scriptures say that Jesus began to eat at the tables of sinners and tax collectors. And the religious leaders looked at this and said, what? How could you do this? We have to remember that tax collectors at the time of Jesus were viewed as the least of society for the Jewish people because they were the betrayers. They were part of the covenant community of God, but yet had partnered with the very essence of the evil regime that the Jewish people saw, and rightly so, as their oppressive controllers. And so not only were they betrayers, but they're betrayers who became quite wealthy because of their betrayal. And yet Jesus is willing to invite even betrayers to follow him. And Jesus is willing to eat at the tables of betrayers. And remember in the scriptures, meals are a relationship. Meals are always relationship. So when Jesus finds himself at these tables, he's finding himself moving relationship towards the unexpected. And where there is not relationship, it means meals are reconciliation. But this disruption. Directly after that, we have this story of the Pharisees and the religious leaders. They're confused by Jesus, and they're confused because, interestingly enough, after the week we've had, they're like, why don't you fast? Look at John the Baptist and all of his disciples. Look at what we do, and everybody's fasting. And like, you're just fun and feasting. And why don't you just, I mean, it's really quite interesting when you're like, you realize the complaint of the Pharisees is like, you're just throwing too many parties, Jesus. Can I just say maybe one of the disruptions we desperately need in this season is to become guilty of throwing too many parties with Jesus? Maybe one of the fruits of disruption we need in this season is that people from the outside looking in are going, hey, I don't think religion is meant to be this fun. Why are you doing this? There's just something in the midst of this, but they confront Jesus about the fact that he doesn't fast with his disciples. And Jesus' response tells us something really significant. He looks at him, he goes, why would you fast when the bridegroom is in town. He was making this radical statement that the entire purpose of fasting was somehow to seek God. And he's saying, why would you fast when God is embodied in the room? The very purpose of your fasting has manifested in front of you. And he does say, a day's coming when I will not be here in person. And in those days, my people will fast. This isn't a statement that fasting in itself is just this false religious paradigm, but yet there is this disruption of the order of things. And he's in many ways speaking to the heart that has been lost. And last, he tells a story of how Jesus on the Sabbath, this day reserved for holiness, and at the times of Jesus had become so perverted away from its original intention, so filled with rules upon rules upon rules. It was really a day of fear and religion, not a day of worship and honor. But on the Sabbath, Jesus is walking alongside and he begins to eat this grain. And one of the man-made rules that had been placed by the Pharisees over the day of worship. And they're confused and they confront Jesus. And ultimately, Jesus makes this claim and he reminds them that David had done something incredibly similar and that their idea of the Sabbath was flawed. But he says this to them. He goes, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is even Lord of the Sabbath. And he begins again through this disruptive moment to shake up and shake off all that they had missed. And in our lives, we often miss the way the tropes of religion make us miss God. We often have a difficult time seeing in ourselves the way we end up going through the motions, the way we make things meant to have profound meaning and purpose and things that are in their nature sacred, that we turn them into false forms because we don't do so with quite the cultural or religious vigor of the Pharisaical or religious community at the time of Jesus. But I want to tell you that I think part of the longing in the season, part of the desire of our own heart in this season is because just like the Pharisees and the religious leaders, we have fallen into the trap of expressing forms of Christ-likeness without the heart of Jesus. And we get trapped within the routine of faith rather than actually allowing Jesus to be the Lord of our hearts. He's the Lord of healing and forgiveness. He is the Lord of sinners and saints. He is the Lord of feasting and fasting. And he is the Lord of all things created in the pursuit of God. And what this entire chapter in a big picture way is simply trying to tell us, it's a really simple invitation, is that it's really easy to miss the heart of Jesus. Gosh, it's really easy. And it's really easy to miss the heart of Jesus and to not see it. I don't think in any of the stories that we see, any of the religious leaders that are struggling with the disruptions of Jesus could see how far away their hearts were. And that's what makes religion in this way of using this word, or false forms of religion that can come inside of our lives, so painful, because they not only rob our heart, they deceive us at the same time. So we can't even see how far away we've actually become. And that's why Jesus disrupts. He disrupts because something has to shake up our lives to finally break through the deception, to see what we couldn't see before. And And again, I just ask you for a minute to just pause and consider your own life. Where in your life do you just begin to see the routines of faith, but without the heart of love in it? Where do you see the expressions of righteousness, but without the true spirit within them? Where has the very things that at first started with the purity of desire for God almost become litmus tests of how you earn him, rather than the radical invitation of how you belong to him? Because how you get out of those things, how we find change and transformation in those things, is only through disruption. Small change will never actually bring the consequence that needs to happen in our lives. It is only when we allow those stories to break us from something to something that they begin to transform us. And I remember another story, a simpler one of a disruption, because I think it speaks in some ways to the more common one, the more common ways that we find ourselves stuck in situations or moments. I went on a date with Ariel a while ago. She was little, she was 3. And kind of a normal thing in our lives for me to have kind of one-on-one dates with my kids. And she wanted to go get ice cream. She wanted to go to the Marietta Square. So we went to the Marietta Square and we got ice cream. And I don't remember the distinct circumstances of that day. All I can tell you is one of those days where this little device that we all carry with us was filled with pastoral need. There were stories and situations that just were in motion, and I was with my daughter in body, but I was with my phone in heart. And we were sitting there having ice cream together, and I was feeling the tension between responding to the things on my phone and responding to my daughter who was sitting in front of me. And multiple times, I mean, Ariel had gotten my attention, and I put my phone down, and I still remember this third time she had requested. She just goes, "Dad, why are you on your phone? Why aren't you here?" That's what she said at 3. It was almost like the Spirit of God picked the language of my daughter, where she looked at me and goes, "Why aren't you here?" Oh, the grief I felt in that moment. It was this phrase of words that had the ability to cut through what I couldn't fully see, couldn't fully discern. And I just felt heartbreak of how easy it was to put on the form of loving my daughter, but how easy it was to lose the actual heart of being with her. Something else had filled the moment. And I think for us, this is the great terror of our lives. Not often are you going to find yourself in the moments of disruption like my first story, because your life is filled with so much pain and sin and lies and consequence that you're absolutely losing yourself. Most of the time, the reality is that the subtle, simple stories that we cannot discern and cannot see will rob and woo our hearts to what we think is required of us, but we'll actually miss the most important thing. We'll miss the most important person. We'll miss the most important invitation. And I believe that what I did in that moment towards my daughter, we have done towards Jesus time and time and time again. How many times have we been with him in body, but our heart is somewhere else. Our heart is somewhere attached to probably some text message that's happening on our phone. This is why we need the disruption of Jesus. And these stories, they begin to tell us not only about who Jesus is, but they begin to tell us about the disruption that Jesus wants to offer. And I just want to lead us to one kind of simple point in the midst of them and out of the story of when Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees around fasting and feasting. But I don't want you to miss the disruptions of the stories. The first story reminds us that Jesus disrupts who we think can follow him. And Jesus disrupts who we think is worthy of him. And I think most distinctly, Jesus disrupts how we think God operates. And the real, if you kind of put this in these black and white characters, the Pharisees believe what we often believe, is that God moves to those who've earned it. But the real disruption is that God does not move towards those who've earned it because no one has earned it. Where does God move? He moves towards those who want him. He just moves where he's wanted. And I think so often we have this way of accidentally trying to live lives to earn God's movement. Can you just let this disruption have some place in your story today? That we do not serve the God who responds to the deserving. We serve the God who responds to the humble. It's the invitation of the disruption of humility. The reason Jesus ate with sinners and tax collectors was because they wanted him. And that same Jesus is moving here and now. We have to find the disruption of not trying to earn Jesus, but coming back to the heart of wanting Jesus. We have to allow that disruption to take place. Think about the third disruption. Stephen, you can come up. Still, even online, we're having people come and help me. Think about that third story of Jesus and the invitation of the Sabbath. The Pharisees are so frustrated that Jesus is dismantling their religious norms. And as Jesus confronts back, he's like, hey, I am not breaking anything of what God has for us. In fact, you are the ones who break it by controlling it. You are the ones who break it by falsely adding to it. You are the ones who break the heart of God and break the commands of God and break the invitations of God by falsifying them into your own interpretations of them and forcing them to become what they were never meant to be. But in a response that Jesus gives, we find this second disruption. It was not this vision that man was made for the Sabbath or that man was made for religious paradigms or these codes that we can enact, but that the Sabbath was made for man. And the real disruption of this picture is the very heart of what spirituality is about. Spirituality was not given to us to perform for God. Spirituality was given to us so that we could actually enjoy living with God. And see, what happens in so many of our lives is that we get reduced down to these false forms of ourselves, and then we begin to pick up this very same identity as the Pharisees on the Sabbath, that somehow we view these invitations of spiritual life, these invitations of God, these invitations of following Jesus, as if there's something we need to live up to. They are not something you need to live up to. The invitation is that someone has already come down to you, and the practices are how you actually celebrate and enjoy the God who's come to you, not how you try to prove your ability to come to him. So many of the circumstances of our lives are because we've gotten the very essence of our spiritual lives backwards. If I can worship like this, if I can pray like this, if I can perform like this, if I can give like this, if I can do this, can I find my way up? But the truth of the invitation of all spiritual life is to learn how to belong to the one who has come down. It's just of a different substance and form. The disruption of how we live our lives with God, you can't miss it. He's the God who turns sinners' tables into holy places. He's the God who turns spiritual practices into the delight of his love. And then this final picture where Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees because he doesn't fast. And I figured, what a timely invitation of God after a week of fasting. And his heart response back to them, this disruption of God, this disruption of Jesus, is really about this disruption of what makes us whole, of what makes us righteous. It's these false paradigms all that are playing together, but ultimately, the invitation that Jesus gives to them is the invitation that he gives to us, which really, as Mark is telling us this next series of stories, is the invitation of all four of these stories bound in one moment. Jesus looks at those around him and he says this: "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." And I think about these stories, and I think about the Pharisees. I think about all of these disruptions and far more to come. They are confused by Jesus. They are frustrated by Jesus. They don't understand what he's doing. They have allowed this way of life to lead them so far away from the heart of God that not only can they not understand what Jesus is doing, they actually view it as a violation to the core of their being. And in that place where they're like, "What are you doing, Jesus? Why are you doing this? How are you allowing this to happen?" Jesus' response is the invitation of disruption in our lives. He says, "You have to understand what I'm here to do. I am here to bring new life." And he uses this expression of new wine to capture his heart for us. And he goes, just like new wine. If you tried to place it in an old wineskin, wine as it ferments, it stretches out the wineskin bags that it was placed within. He looks at them and he says, "Don't you understand? If I poured this new wine into this old wineskin, I would burst it." And what we miss often about this passage is the kindness of what Jesus is saying. He's actually looking at the Pharisees and he's saying to them, you know what's interesting is as much as you think lowly of me, as much as you're frustrated by me, can I tell you my heart for you? I'm not trying to destroy you. Why am I not going to pour new wine right on you, where you are, on what you're doing? Because it would burst you. There is not a container that can hold what I'm trying to do. So this is the invitation. this new wine, this new life, this new hope, this new joy, this new way, this new heart. It requires God first and foremost creating a new vessel that can receive it. And what Mark is telling us, what Jesus is doing, what the gospel is inviting us into, is the understanding of what disruption is really all about. There is no disruption of circumstance that can change you. There is only a disruption of heart that can change you. What Jesus wants to do through circumstance is actually move you to begin to see the reason you're stuck. Let me speak what might feel like a hard truth. You are not stuck because of your circumstances. You are not stuck because of your responsibilities. You are not stuck because of the decisions other people are making. You are not stuck for all of the scenarios and the reasons which make it feel very real to be stuck in our lives. Every single one of us, where we find ourselves in need of breakthrough, where we find ourselves in need of transformation, where we find ourselves in need of change, we have to let the true Jesus speak the truth to our hearts. What is required is a change of heart, not a change of schedule, not a change of circumstance, not a change of situation. Yes, there is going to be invitations of the practical. I'm not saying that all things of profound truth and change don't bleed out into the rhythms of the day-to-days of our lives. But if we do not see where they come from, if we do not see the foundation of them, if we do not see where they begin, then we will never let them occur. God is after disruption in this season, but the disruption that has to happen the most is the disruption of our hearts. It's the disruption of our lives from the inside out. And I think the prayers of who we are need to begin to shift. Because I think for a long season, we've been praying for God to disrupt our circumstances. And I think he wants to. But I think we have to have the awareness that what God really needs to do is the disruption of our hearts. Certainly, this is a picture of salvation, but it's not just a picture of salvation. It's a picture of the way God moves. I believe that what God wants to do in our lives, it requires a new wineskin. I believe that there are so many of us, myself included, that we are crying out for God to move. And I think the kindness of God is he's looking at us and saying, do you not know what would happen if I poured this new wine into the container that you've created? I care about you too much. If you want new wine, we have to start with a new wineskin. We have to start with the thing that can actually possess it. Because the disruption of Jesus isn't just after the change of our circumstances. It's actually trying to come back to the change of our heart posture, and the way we see the world. We need the disruption of Jesus. You need the disruption of Jesus. And to find it, we have to learn the lessons of Mark 2. We have to start with the disruption of there is one who has the authority to heal and forgive. We have to move into the disruption of humility. We have to move into the disruption that our spiritual life is not about finding our way up to him, but about making room for the one who comes down to us. There has to be the disruption, but they're all leading to the last invitation. The disruption of God, that he wants to make a new wineskin. I believe he wants to make new wineskins out of our lives. I believe he wants to make new wineskins out of what we think marriage is. I think he wants to make new wineskins out of what we think singleness is. I think he wants to make new wineskins out of what we think parenting is. I think he wants to make new wineskins out of what we think our homes are. I think he wants to make new wineskins out of what we think church is, what we think the purpose of our lives are, what we think disciple making is. I'm telling you that where God is taking us, it is going to have to be a place where we allow him to shake off all of these places where we have been going through the motions and lost the heart of who we are, and allow God to move in a way that we never thought possible. These are the things I'm praying for us, and the distinct things that I see. Jesus is looking for a movement that will allow him to pour out his new wine of transformation. But every old wineskin we carry into it won't work. It won't work. God is looking for us as a people to allow his disruption, but to join him in his disruption. And I just want to close with this. I think where does it start? I think it starts with the simplicity of recognizing the disruption you need, you can't perform. I think if there's any great truth of Mark 2, is that Jesus alone can change things. Jesus alone can move. And I want to ask you this morning, what would it look like to name all the places that need disruption in your life? What would it look like to name all the places that feel stuck? Where are you going through the motions? And that's not an accusation. It's not that I'm saying routine or covenant or commitment is somehow a false form of faith. That's not what I believe at all. But where are you sitting at ice cream with Jesus? And you might be with him in body, but your heart is 1,000 miles away. I think you have to name it. And I think you have to ask God into it. And then what will happen, because God is faithful, he will disrupt you. And when the day comes that he does, you're going to have to make a choice about whether you're willing to partner with it and step into it and allow mess to lead you into new life. Because what we're going to see as we move through Mark, what starts with disruption moves towards mess, and what moves towards mess moves towards life. We just have to let him do what he's trying to do. Can we take these final moments? Steve is just going to play. I want to allow a moment. Can we just pray? And then I'll come and close our time. But Jesus, we here this morning, we just ask that you would minister to us. Would you teach us the lessons of Mark 2? Or even today where we maybe take time and slow down and read these stories. Would we just allow you to speak to the circumstances of our lives in the middle of them? We need you, Jesus, our disruptor. Come and change, come and disrupt, come and heal, come and save, come and forgive, come and teach us who you are and what you're really like. And right now, God, we just offer to you in our best attempt all of the places we need you to come and move. So church, wherever you are, just would you take 30 seconds and tell Jesus where you need him to come and disrupt. Put that in front of him as an invitation of belief in his character, just for a moment. Jesus, have us. We long for you. Lord, would you shape us into a house of your new wine? Teach us the lessons we need to learn. God, we thank you that you are good news wrapped in a person. You are the God who can save and forgive, heal and transform. You are the God who loves to sit at tables of the unworthy. And you're the God looking at a people always trying to come up to you, who came down to us. Thank you, Jesus. We love you and we honor you. Come and have your way in this season. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Well, listen, may God bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you. May he turn his countenance to you. And may you know everywhere you go this week, you are radically loved by Jesus. Can't wait to see you in person next Sunday. Love you guys.